They called him a trespasser, on the land he built with his own hands. When the HOA caught Grandpa fishing in what they claimed was their private lake, they didn't expect the truth to surface. 3 minutes after calling the cops, their perfect neighborhood began to crumble, one lawsuit at a time. The story will continue, but before that, I need to know, which country are you watching this from? I'm serious, drop it in the comments, I want to see where my story is reaching. The morning mist hung low over the quiet suburban lake, rippling gently as an old man in a faded fishing hat sat at its edge. His name was Walter Hayes, known to the few who remembered the town before it became a planned community. He had lived here long before there were paved driveways, manicured lawns, or HOA bylaws printed in glossy binders. The lake was his solace, a mirror of memories from the life he'd built on that very soil decades ago. Every morning, Walter came down with his fishing pole, a small tackle box, and his old thermos. He would sit beneath the willow tree that had grown from the seed his late wife once planted. It wasn't just water to him, it was history, memory, and peace. But peace was a foreign word to the new residents of Clearwater Estates, a high-end gated community ruled by the HOA, the homeowners association that seemed more like a private government than a neighborhood committee. Their rules were strict, their patrols constant, and their obsession with order unrelenting. To them, Walter's presence near the lake wasn't nostalgic, it was an eyesore. The old man didn't fit into their picture-perfect world of white fences, trimmed hedges, and silent security cameras. His house, standing just outside the newly fenced perimeter, was a stubborn reminder that this land wasn't always under HOA control. The trouble began one sunny Friday when an HOA board member, a woman named Linda Carver, noticed Walter sitting by the lake through her binoculars. She was known around the neighborhood as the enforcer, the kind of woman who could spot an unapproved mailbox color from half a mile away. To her, the old man by the lake wasn't just fishing, he was violating the sacred rules of Clearwater Estates. Within minutes, Linda was marching down the hill, clipboard in hand, snapping photos from her phone. Her voice, though unheard from afar, carried the tone of someone who believed she was protecting something important, her authority. She didn't care that the man was old or that the lake had been part of his property before Clearwater Estates even existed. All she saw was a trespasser. By the time Walter packed up his pole and started back toward his home, she had already filed an HOA complaint and sent a report to the local police department. The accusation? Trespassing and unauthorized fishing on private HOA property. The officers arrived that afternoon, two young men who didn't understand the history of the place, only the paperwork they'd been handed. They approached Walter politely, but with a firmness that made it clear they were responding to an official complaint. And as the old man tried to explain that the lake had always been part of his land, the officers shook their heads. According to the county's most recent property map, the shoreline now fell within HOA boundaries. Walter didn't argue. He simply nodded, packed up his gear again, and walked away. But the silence in his eyes spoke louder than words, a silence that would soon turn into something the HOA could never have imagined. What Linda and the HOA didn't know was that Walter wasn't just a quiet retiree. He was a man with a deep understanding of land law, property rights, and patience, the kind of patience that comes from watching decades of change. He had seen the community's expansion, the construction, the zoning adjustments, and he had kept every record. As the sun set behind the lake that evening, Walter sat at his old oak desk, unfolding a stack of yellowed papers and survey maps. He traced the outlines of the land, the original deed boundaries, and the lake's formation records. The HOA had built its precious walking path and private pier on what legally still belonged to him. And as the clock ticked past midnight, the man who once quietly fished by the water began drafting something far more powerful, a lawsuit that would soon make Clearwater Estates a name every homeowner in the country would recognize. The HOA had called the cops on an old man for fishing. But they had just opened a door to a $2 million mistake. The following morning, Clearwater Estates woke to the usual symphony of suburban perfection, sprinklers ticking in perfect rhythm, robotic mowers humming over emerald lawns, and the faint echo of golf carts rolling toward the lakefront. No one suspected that the quiet old man they'd shamed the day before was already preparing to turn their paradise into a courtroom battlefield. Walter Hayes sat in his study, the air thick with the scent of old paper and ink. Sunlight poured through the blinds, landing on stacks of folders that hadn't been opened in years. He had kept everything: land purchase receipts from 1973, boundary maps drawn in fading ink, and an original title deed signed by the county registrar. Each page told a story of ownership, one that predated the existence of Clearwater Estates by nearly 40 years. When the HOA had expanded the neighborhood 5 years earlier, they'd bought adjacent lots from a development firm. The lake, which naturally divided the old farmland, had been redrawn onto the HOA map after a rushed survey. But that survey, Walter knew, had been based on an outdated copy of the property lines, not the registered ones. The land they claimed as private property still legally belonged to him. He turned over the oldest map, his trembling fingers tracing the waterline. The original surveyor's signature, nearly invisible now, marked a boundary that sliced right through what the HOA proudly called Lake Clearwater. The walking path, the fishing dock, even part of their prized gazebo, all technically stood on his soil. Walter's years as a retired civil engineer hadn't gone to waste. He understood zoning laws, easements, and rights of access better than anyone on that HOA board. For years, he'd kept quiet, letting them build their fences and piers, knowing one day, their arrogance would cross the line, quite literally. That day had arrived. He picked up the phone and called a name he hadn't dialed in nearly a decade, Samuel Brooks, property attorney. Samuel was an old friend, one of those no-nonsense lawyers who had spent his life fighting land disputes. Within an hour, Samuel was sitting across the desk, flipping through the dusty folders with growing astonishment. By noon, he looked up and said exactly what Walter already knew: the HOA had made a catastrophic legal error. Their expansion onto the lakefront violated both state easement laws and the county's property registry. In plain terms, they were trespassing on his land. Samuel's eyes glinted with quiet satisfaction as he began organizing the documents into a legal sequence. It wasn't just about fishing anymore. This was about rights, respect, and the arrogance of people who thought their rules outweighed the law itself. Meanwhile, across the neighborhood, the HOA board gathered in their spotless conference room for an emergency meeting. Linda Carver, sitting at the head of the table, proudly replayed the footage she'd recorded of the trespasser. On the big screen, Walter's calm, weathered figure sat peacefully by the lake, hardly the menace she claimed he was. But her tone carried authority, and most of the board followed her lead without question. They voted to issue a formal notice of violation, a thick envelope stamped with the HOA's seal. Inside, a fine of $1,200 and a warning that any further illegal presence near the lake would result in legal action. When Walter received the letter, he smiled. Not because of the fine, but because of the signature at the bottom: Linda Carver, president of Clearwater Estates HOA. That signature was all he needed. It was the documented proof that the HOA had knowingly acted on property that wasn't theirs. 2 days later, the HOA received a letter in return, not a complaint, but a notice of litigation. It was concise, formal, and devastating. It stated that Clearwater Estates HOA had unlawfully encroached on private property, interfered with rightful ownership, and caused emotional distress through harassment and defamation. Damages claimed, $2 million. The boardroom that had once buzzed with self-importance now fell silent. Linda's confident smile cracked for the first time. They called emergency lawyers, realtors, even the county survey office, but the evidence was undeniable. When the police report resurfaced, it made things worse. The HOA had not only filed a false trespassing complaint but also involved law enforcement in an act of unlawful claim over private property. What had started as a petty power play now looked like a coordinated abuse of authority. By the end of the week, word had spread across town. News reporters caught wind of the story: HOA sued for $2 million after calling cops on elderly homeowner. Neighbors began whispering. Some stood by the HOA, but many couldn't ignore the fact that an old man had been humiliated over something as innocent as fishing. The calm surface of Clearwater Estates began to ripple. Board members started resigning quietly, fearing personal liability. Homeowners demanded answers, and Linda's once unshakable position began to crumble under pressure. But Walter didn't gloat. He didn't appear on the news, didn't post on social media, and didn't even change his daily routine. Every morning, he still walked to the same willow tree, poured himself a cup of coffee, and stared at the lake, his lake. He wasn't after revenge. He was after truth. And the truth was now public record. As legal proceedings began, the HOA realized the case wasn't just about ownership. It was about every mistake they'd ever buried, every unapproved construction, every unfair fine, every manipulated record. The lawsuit had cracked open the dam, and what was about to flood out would destroy their perfect little empire. And as Walter's lawyer prepared the next phase, gathering witnesses, subpoenaing documents, and securing a formal court hearing, the old man sat quietly, knowing the storm was only beginning. The HOA had thought they could silence him with rules and intimidation. But they had just awakened a force more powerful than any bylaw: the truth written in ink, sealed by time, and ready to surface. The news broke on a Tuesday morning, the kind of headline that makes people stop scrolling. Local HOA sued for $2 million after calling cops on elderly man fishing. Within hours, the story spread across Facebook groups, neighborhood forums, and morning talk shows. The image of Walter Hayes, sitting by the lake with his fishing pole, became the symbol of something bigger, the fight between ordinary homeowners and the unchecked power of HOAs. But for Clearwater Estates, it was the beginning of a nightmare. By noon, cameras and reporters gathered near the neighborhood's pristine front gate. Drones hovered above the lake, capturing shots of the very pier and path that now stood at the center of the lawsuit. Homeowners peeked from behind curtains, some shocked, others quietly amused that the HOA, which once fined people for mailbox colors, was now facing public humiliation. Inside her home, Linda Carver watched the coverage with disbelief. She had spent years building her image as a protector of community values, the kind of person who believed control equaled order. But now, her name was being dragged through the mud as the woman who called the police on an old man for fishing on his own land. The HOA tried to contain the damage. They released an official statement, calling the situation a misunderstanding and claiming they acted within community regulations. But the internet had already made up its mind. The tone was set. The world had chosen a side, and it wasn't theirs. Comment sections filled with outrage. Former residents of other neighborhoods began sharing their own HOA horror stories. The hashtags #LetGrandpaFish and #HOAJustice started trending. Influencers made reaction videos, local radio stations debated it on air. What began as a quiet property dispute had exploded into a national conversation about abuse of authority and corporate greed disguised as neighborhood governance. Meanwhile, Walter stayed out of the spotlight. He didn't want fame, he wanted resolution. But he couldn't ignore how people had rallied behind him. Letters began arriving at his door, handwritten notes from strangers thanking him for standing up to the system. One came from a veteran who had lost his home to an HOA fine spiral, another from a young couple who had been bullied over minor violations. Every envelope reminded Walter that this wasn't just about him anymore. His case had become a voice for countless people who had been silenced. The HOA, on the other hand, was falling apart from the inside. Board members started to turn on each other, accusing Linda of overreach and poor judgment. The community newsletter that once featured cheerful updates about landscaping and events now carried terse legal notices. Homeowners demanded transparency about how their association fees were being spent, especially after learning those funds were now being used to fight a $2 million lawsuit. The pressure was suffocating. When the first court hearing date was announced, local news stations lined up outside the courthouse. Walter arrived quietly, wearing a neatly pressed suit and holding his old leather briefcase. Behind him walked Samuel Brooks, the property attorney whose calm confidence contrasted sharply with the flustered HOA representatives. Linda and her board appeared on the other side, flanked by expensive corporate lawyers. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. One side stood for principle, the other for power. Inside the courtroom, the arguments began. The HOA's lawyers tried to frame Walter as an outsider, claiming he'd misunderstood modern zoning lines. But then Samuel rose and began presenting the evidence, the original deed, the county survey, the notarized property transfer documents. Each one landed like a hammer. When the judge examined the earliest records, her expression shifted. She asked one simple question: was this property line ever legally altered through county approval? The HOA's lawyer hesitated. He shuffled through his papers, stammering. The answer was no. The HOA had assumed control of land they never legally owned. The courtroom fell silent. Outside, the story caught fire again. Reporters broadcast every word, and by evening, millions had seen the moment the HOA's defense began to collapse. Clearwater Estates became a symbol, not of luxury living, but of arrogance undone. Real estate blogs wrote think pieces, legal experts discussed the implications on live TV, and homeowners across the country began questioning their own HOAs. For the first time, the HOA board realized this wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a public reckoning. In the days that followed, membership attendance at HOA meetings plummeted. Homeowners avoided the board entirely, fearing guilt by association. Realtors reported that potential buyers were backing out of deals, unwilling to move into a lawsuit neighborhood. Financially, Clearwater Estates was bleeding. Insurance premiums skyrocketed, legal fees mounted, and their once pristine image was now a cautionary tale shared nationwide. And through it all, Walter remained composed. He didn't seek interviews or statements. He spent his evenings on his porch, watching the sunset over the lake that was now undeniably his. But deep down, he knew the fight wasn't over yet. The HOA's pride was wounded, but not dead. They were planning something, a desperate attempt to regain control, to prove that they still had power. And in that desperate act, they would make one final mistake, one that would cost them everything. Clearwater Estates was unraveling. What had once been the pride of the community, a showcase of perfect lawns, glossy mailboxes, and glittering water views, had become a ghost of itself. The walking paths were empty, the HOA clubhouse sat deserted, and "for sale" signs began popping up like weeds. But despite the silence, behind closed doors, the HOA leadership was panicking. Their financial reserves were draining fast. The lawsuit had frozen community accounts, and homeowner dues were no longer enough to cover legal fees. The board's emergency meetings grew frantic, filled with arguments, blame, and whispered talk of bankruptcy. And at the center of it all sat Linda Carver, the woman whose ego had started the fire and who now refused to let it burn out. She couldn't accept defeat. She couldn't stand the thought that an old man with a fishing pole had dismantled her perfect empire. So, she came up with one final plan. A desperate, reckless plan. Late one evening, under the dim light of the HOA conference room, Linda gathered the remaining loyal members. She laid out a proposal: the HOA would commission a new survey of the property. A survey that would, conveniently, redraw the boundaries in their favor. She had already contacted a small land services firm known for its flexibility. For a price, they'd create maps that could clarify misunderstandings. If she could present the new survey to the court, she believed they could cast doubt on Walter's ownership claim, enough to delay the case and pressure him into settling. The others hesitated, uneasy. Tampering with official land documents wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. But Linda's tone was commanding, her fear disguised as confidence. She framed it as a strategic correction, not fraud. "This community needs protection," she said coldly. "From people like him." And so, the desperate move began. Within days, a new survey quietly appeared, backdated, signed, and stamped. The HOA's lawyers submitted it as newly discovered evidence. They claimed it proved the lake had been part of Clearwater's planned area since the initial expansion. But there was one fatal flaw. They underestimated Walter. When his attorney, Samuel Brooks, received a copy of the new survey, he immediately noticed the inconsistencies. The date stamp didn't match the registry logs. The file format was from a software version that didn't even exist at the time. It wasn't just tampered, it was fabricated. Samuel didn't confront them directly. He waited, quietly collecting proof. He reached out to the county's land office and obtained the original digital records. He traced the metadata, the timestamps, and even the surveyor's signature, which turned out to be copied from another project entirely. Within 48 hours, they had irrefutable evidence of document fraud. When the next court hearing began, the HOA came prepared to unveil their new discovery. Linda stood tall, her voice steady but her eyes tired. She believed this was her comeback moment, the chance to reclaim the narrative. But as she proudly handed over the survey, Samuel rose with a quiet authority that silenced the entire room. He walked to the front, holding two documents side by side, the fabricated survey and the original, authenticated county file. And then he spoke. He described the digital trail, the altered timestamps, the mismatched registry signatures. Each point landed like a blow. The courtroom watched as Linda's confident expression crumbled. The judge's gaze turned sharp, her patience thinning by the second. By the time Samuel finished, the room was dead silent. The HOA's lawyer stammered, trying to explain, but it was over. The judge ordered an immediate investigation into the falsified document. What was meant to be their saving move had now become a criminal inquiry. Reporters outside captured every detail. The story exploded again, HOA accused of forging land documents in $2 million lawsuit. Overnight, Clearwater Estates became a national scandal. News crews camped outside the gates. Homeowners demanded Linda's resignation. The state attorney's office opened an ethics probe. Inside her home, Linda sat in darkness, surrounded by the remnants of her empire, stacked binders, HOA letters, and the golden nameplate from her office desk. Everything she'd built on pride and control was gone. Meanwhile, Walter remained composed. His days hadn't changed. He still rose early, brewed his coffee, and sat by the lake that reflected both peace and justice. But now, as he gazed over the calm water, there was a new quiet strength in him, a deep satisfaction that truth, no matter how long buried, always finds a way to rise. Yet the legal war wasn't finished. The HOA's lawyers were withdrawing, one by one. Homeowners were filing complaints of their own. And the county, now involved, had discovered something far worse. Several other permits issued by Clearwater Estates during its expansion were also falsified. The HOA's foundation wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing. As the sun dipped low that evening, Walter sat under the willow tree and watched the flickering lights across the lake. He knew the next chapter wouldn't be about revenge or money. It would be about closure. Because the HOA's empire had fallen, but the reckoning had only just begun. The cracks that had begun as whispers were now full-blown fractures. Clearwater Estates, once the picture-perfect dream of suburban order, was imploding from within. Every polished surface now reflected decay, lawns uncut, driveways stained, and neighbors who once smiled at each other now refused to make eye contact. The illusion of control had vanished. After the court exposed the falsified survey, chaos swept through the HOA like wildfire. Local news stations replayed the footage of the courtroom reveal on a loop, the narrator's voice slicing through the silence, the Clearwater HOA accused of falsifying documents in a $2 million lawsuit filed by elderly homeowner Walter Hayes. Every broadcast pulled another thread from the fabric of their credibility. And as the truth spread, so did the consequences. The county immediately launched a full audit of Clearwater Estates. Investigators poured through years of HOA records, budget statements, meeting notes, construction approvals. What they found was worse than anyone imagined. Unapproved spending. Inflated contractor payments. Missing maintenance funds. Even private bonuses to certain board members, quietly labeled as administrative reimbursements. The HOA's reputation wasn't just tarnished, it was toxic. Within days, homeowners began demanding resignations. An emergency town hall meeting was called, but what unfolded that evening wasn't a meeting, it was an uprising. Dozens of residents packed into the community clubhouse, their voices echoing off the walls. They weren't there to discuss landscaping or bylaws. They wanted answers. They wanted justice. Linda Carver, once the proud president, walked into the room to a chorus of murmurs and cold stares. The people she had ruled over for years were no longer intimidated by her authority. The calm, polished control she had always carried was gone. When the floor opened for questions, the first voice cut through the air like a blade. "How long have you been lying to us?" There were no lawyers to shield her now, no scripted statements. Every accusation landed heavy: the fines, the forged survey, the missing money. By the time the meeting ended, the board had effectively dissolved. The HOA was leaderless. The following morning, the county issued a notice of intent to suspend Clearwater Estates' charter. The HOA's assets were frozen pending the investigation, and state auditors began their descent into every transaction they could trace. But for Walter Hayes, it wasn't about revenge or headlines. It was about peace. He had never wanted to destroy the community, he just wanted them to see what they'd become. But as the investigation deepened, even he was shocked by the level of corruption uncovered. What was meant to be a small fight for his property rights had turned into a legal domino effect that would reshape the neighborhood forever. Samuel Brooks, his attorney, met him one afternoon on the porch overlooking the lake. He handed Walter a thick envelope, a court notice confirming that Clearwater Estates had officially lost its case. The ruling was clear and irreversible: the HOA had trespassed, falsified evidence, and abused its authority. They were ordered to pay $2 million in damages, plus legal fees and penalties. The judgment was monumental, not just for Walter, but for homeowners across the state. News outlets hailed it as a landmark victory against HOA overreach. Lawyers began citing it in similar cases. Walter Hayes, the quiet old man with a fishing pole, had just set a legal precedent. Meanwhile, Clearwater Estates was crumbling financially. Insurance companies refused to cover their losses. Banks froze their accounts. The HOA's office, once filled with binders and pride, now sat abandoned, papers scattered across the floor, nameplates removed, and computers seized for evidence. Linda Carver resigned in disgrace. Her face, once on every neighborhood newsletter, now appeared on national broadcasts as the symbol of HOA corruption. Investigators discovered her involvement in the forged survey, and she faced potential criminal charges for document tampering and fraud. Homeowners, left without leadership or direction, voted to dissolve the HOA entirely. Without the association's control, the neighborhood slowly began to breathe again. People painted their homes the colors they wanted. Kids played in driveways without being scolded. Neighbors who had avoided each other started talking again, united not by rules, but by relief. And every morning, Walter continued his quiet routine. He walked to the lake, poured his coffee, and cast his fishing line into the calm water. The willow tree swayed gently behind him, the same one his wife had planted decades earlier. The land was his again, legally, peacefully, eternally. But there was something deeper happening now. The lake, once the center of conflict, had become a place of reflection for the entire community. Former HOA members, humbled and regretful, would sometimes stop by just to apologize. Walter never held grudges. He'd smile, nod, and remind them softly that everyone learns, some the easy way, some the hard way. By the end of summer, the sign at the neighborhood gate came down. The once proud metal letters that read, Clearwater Estates HOA, were replaced with something simpler, Clearwater Lake Community, established 1973. The year Walter first built his home. The story could have ended there, with peace restored and justice served. But there was still one more chapter, one that would show how one man's quiet stand could echo far beyond the fences of a neighborhood. Because as Walter's case spread across the country, other communities began to fight back, too. His story became a spark, igniting a movement that would change how HOAs operated forever. The lawsuit was over, but its echo refused to fade. What had begun as a quiet standoff by a lake had become a story that rippled across the country, a story told in newsrooms, classrooms, and living rooms alike. Walter Hayes, once dismissed as a stubborn old man clinging to the past, had become a symbol of something far greater: integrity standing against arrogance, truth standing against power. Clearwater Estates no longer existed. The gates had come down, the bylaws had been shredded, and the HOA signs had been replaced with a modest wooden board that read simply, "Welcome to Clearwater Lake, a community, not a corporation." But the real legacy wasn't in the neighborhood's new name. It was in the way people began to change. For years, the residents had lived under silent pressure, the constant scrutiny of inspectors, fines for small imperfections, and fear of standing out. The HOA had trained them to follow, to conform, to obey. But now, for the first time in decades, they felt something new: freedom. Kids ran barefoot on the grass without worry of lawn violations. Families held barbecues by the lake. People waved to Walter when he walked by, not out of pity or curiosity, but out of respect. And yet, while peace had returned, the story didn't end at Clearwater. Walter's victory went viral. News anchors debated the ethics of HOAs. Legal experts discussed how his case exposed the unchecked authority of private associations. Property law podcasts called it the Clearwater case, a benchmark ruling that forced state lawmakers to revisit outdated HOA statutes. Soon, similar stories began to surface nationwide. In one town, a veteran sued his HOA for banning the flagpole in his yard, and won, citing Walter's case as precedent. In another, a widow reclaimed her garden after years of fines. The legal language from Hayes versus Clearwater Estates became the backbone of new reforms designed to protect homeowners from harassment and overreach. And through it all, Walter never sought the spotlight. When journalists came to interview him, he spoke softly, with no bitterness in his voice. He never mentioned the money, the $2 million judgment that had made headlines. Because to him, it wasn't about wealth. It was about dignity. He donated most of the settlement to a legal aid foundation that helped low-income homeowners defend themselves against HOA abuse. The foundation was named the Willow Project, after the tree that shaded him through every storm, every loss, every victory. Each year, Walter hosted a small gathering by the lake, a quiet event open to anyone who wanted to reflect, share stories, or simply sit by the water. People came from all over: veterans, families, young couples, all with one thing in common: they had fought back against something unfair and won. As the years passed, the neighborhood aged with grace. The lake grew even more beautiful, its stillness a reminder of the fight that had restored it. The willow tree grew tall and strong, its branches now stretching across the shoreline, casting long shadows over the place where Walter once sat alone. Eventually, the time came when Walter no longer walked down to the lake every morning. His health faded quietly, the same way he had lived, with patience, calm, and strength. When he passed, the town gathered at the water's edge for a memorial. There were no suits or speeches, just people standing in silence, watching the ripples spread across the surface of the lake he loved so much. Someone placed his old fishing pole against the willow tree. Another poured a cup of coffee and set it beside it, just the way Walter used to start his mornings. A plaque was placed there later that year. It read, "In memory of Walter Hayes, the man who reminded us that justice begins with courage." And below, engraved in smaller letters, "Let Grandpa fish." The phrase that once fueled online outrage had now become a message of hope, a reminder that even the smallest act of defiance, when rooted in truth, can echo louder than power. Years later, a young reporter filming a documentary about HOA reform visited the lake. The community had changed entirely: no fences, no guards, no fines. Just neighbors, living freely. As her camera panned over the water, she narrated softly, "This is where it all began. A quiet man, a fishing pole, and a fight for what was right." Clearwater Lake isn't just a story about one man's victory. It's proof that sometimes, justice doesn't shout, it simply stands its ground and waits for the truth to surface. The willow tree swayed gently in the background, its leaves whispering across the water. The sun dipped low, turning the lake into liquid gold. And though Walter Hayes was gone, his legacy lived on, in every homeowner who dared to ask questions, in every community that chose kindness over control, and in every soul who believed that no matter how small your voice may be, the truth always finds its way to the surface. Because justice, like water, cannot be fenced in forever.